Hi folks on the stream initially. I haven't gone on the air yet, so I can give a bit of an explanation as I do each week as to what this is about. Every week I have a stream here. We run 90 minutes worth of pre-recorded material on a given subject to try and stimulate conversation, the good old-fashioned amateur radio rag chew, after the 90 minutes worth of streamed material. So I'm starting at 9:30, it's now 9:28, and on the air at 9:30, as I do every Saturday night. And then 90 minutes later at 11 p.m. Melbourne time, we hope to run a QSO, a conversation on the air with other radio hams. We have several regulars, but I'm hoping a few more will call in this week. We have no drop frames at the moment. I'll just check my streaming. Yes, we're streaming. So we're being seen, which is good. And it's 9:29, and at 9:30 I go on the air. So I'll hit that button, that crucial button, and hopefully that transmitter will do its job, and we'll be on the air. I'll just turn the heater down because its fan is making a lot of noise. There we go, the inescapable fans of power supplies, heaters and computers these days. It's actually a problem. 9:30 p.m, we'll go on the air. Hello, this is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima from Burwood East and live streaming on YouTube live stream. If you care to look in at the video component of what we're transmitting, please Google VK3AML for June 2022. That's Google the phrase VK3AML for June 2022 and you'll get the video that accompanies this audio that you're hearing on 147.475 megs. Well, this week I'm covering the history of sound recording from cylinders to stereo, an area of electronic work that many people on ham radio have been involved with in one way or another, broadcasting peripherally in the disc recording industry centrally. And I hope this introduces people to a few new concepts and new films. There are a lot of films available on the history of sound recording, shot contemporaneously in the 1920s and earlier, but many of them are not presentable for a variety of reasons, and I've done a lot of cleaning up as far as I can of some very defective films on this occasion. My thanks particularly to the chap who runs the website or the YouTube site Topclassical for the usage of a Columbia Records documentary from 1928. This is currently available by LF Mudge, I think, on internet, but in a very degraded copy, maybe 20 copies removed from the original. I'll be transmitting something that's considerably clearer and cleaner, I hope, tonight. I know that this will particularly be of interest to people like VK3SL and VK3ECG, who are both involved with the music industry and with sound recording because of that. So first of all, I'd like to take you to another room of this house, to a little bit of video that I recorded earlier, to introduce you to the subject. I will be playing a bit of music in the background of this, but this is purely for illustration of technical processes, and a lot of it is music that's in the background of documentaries that I cannot eliminate without eliminating the narration. So I hope this doesn't aggravate anybody. I notice that in the Radio Comms Act, entertainment is outlawed for ham radio, but music, in Australia at least, is not, as long as it's not intended as entertainment, and this is intended as technical instruction. So, over to the other room and myself in slightly different costuming earlier in the day. Hello, this is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima with the regular Saturday night test transmission. I thought I'd start tonight's transmission in an unusual way. I'm standing beside an Edison Diamond Disc phonograph, a disc phonograph from 1924. On that disc and in that machine, I suppose 1924 is forever frozen. And the discs made with this machine were made in an unusual way. They were vertically cut, that is, the modulation was in hills and dales in the groove rather than by lateral side-to-side movement of the needle. And this was the first machine to have a diamond needle for playback. And as tonight I'll be talking about the history of sound recording, it's probably appropriate that I start with the first recording studio of all, Thomas Edison's recording studio in West Orange, New Jersey, just outside New York. Anyway, let's wind this old girl up and see if she can still produce a noise. Now, notice I'm recording off this machine with a Zoom H2 digital recorder, and this is the waterfall analysis of that playback. You'll see that it's very strictly limited to 300 Hertz to about 2.8K. But it's possible, by using this waterfall display, to find the resonances and dips and flatten the frequency response, as you see here with suitable equalisers, so that it sounds like this. And now we have a frequency response of about 180 Hertz to 5K, couple of octaves extra. Okay, at some future date I will do a live stream on the correction of audio frequency response, and particularly with early recordings you're dealing with dips and peaks up to 20 dB across the audio spectrum. Those we can deal with digital equalisation, parametric equalisation, graphic equalisation very easily, so that early recordings made before the advent of electrical recording, when everything was done with horns and plumbing, as you will see in a moment, we can now correct those recordings and make them sound better and clearer than they ever have in the past. So let's go right back to the start of recording and a documentary on the work of the man who gave us the start of all of this, Thomas Edison. Hello, this is VK... And that's not Thomas Edison. Oh dear, first blunder of the night. Here we go.
In Menlo Park, Edison buys a large house for his family, which now includes a daughter and son, Marion and Tom Jr., whom the former telegrapher nicknames Dot and Dash. For the single men, there's a boarding house. Just a few steps away is the office and library. And just beyond that is the laboratory, the heart of Edison's small communal village. With generous financing, mostly from Western Union, and with the best supplies and tools at hand, Edison and his team set to work on several projects in the summer of 1876. One is a repeating telegraph, a device to record an incoming message on a disc, then repeat it to the next station down the line. At the same time, Edison is also working on a new transmitter for the telephone recently invented by Alexander Graham Bell. Somewhat envious because Bell invented the telephone before he could, Edison now wants to solve Bell's main problem. The voices can barely be heard. On the night of July 18, 1877, while Edison and his boys are in the lab testing a diaphragm from the telephone transmitter, Edison makes a momentous discovery.
He was playing in the laboratory one night, and as they were playing with the diaphragm, he put his finger under it and realized that there was enough movement there that he might be able to cause an impression in a piece of wax paper or something else that would allow him to, in a sense, repeat the message, to play it once it was recorded, to play it back so it could continue over the line.
That night, Edison scribbles in his notebook, "There is no doubt that I shall be able to store up and reproduce automatically at any future time the human voice." Full of confidence, Edison thinks he will now invent a kind of telephone answering and repeating machine. But he's actually about to invent something far more original and revolutionary: the world's first phonograph. The path from idea to invention is rarely straight or smooth. Even at Thomas Edison's invention factory in 1877. When Edison starts thinking about a phonograph, he knows that he won't be the first to record sound. A Frenchman named Léon Scott de Martinville had already done that 20 years before on a machine he called the phonautograph. What Edison doesn't know, however, is that another Frenchman, Charles Cros, had recently written a paper describing a way to play back sound as well as record it.
And I'm going to interrupt that there to say this is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima, and I notice that we've got a copyright alert, so I'll skip forward to the next item. The Immortal Voice, produced in 1923, was a documentary on the work of Victor Records, later RCA Victor, in the last days of pre-electric recording. The last days of pre-electric recording. And the Immortal Voice documents the mechanical recording of the voice. This was, within 2 years, revolutionised by Western Electric, the manufacturing side of Bell Telephone Labs, to produce electrical recording with microphones and amplifiers, which solved all of the mechanical resonance problems that were inherent in the acoustic recording process. So, the Immortal Voice. And the person you're seeing there is Rosa Poncelli, American soprano of that period. I'll read out the intertitles. Only the fortunate few can enjoy the great operas in the exclusive temples of music that grace the capitals of the world. This is, of course, a silent film. Uncounted millions of music lovers must worship from afar, and yet the golden voices that are heard in the Metropolitan now sing nightly in the humblest homes throughout the land. The phonograph, a glorious achievement of man's inventive genius, has wrought this beautiful miracle. And we see a gramophone of that period. "100 years from now, the voice of Rosa Poncelli of the Metropolitan Opera Company will bring delight to our children's children." And we see Rosa Poncelli in the Victor Studios in 1923, singing literally down a funnel, a conical horn that's connected to, well, we'll see in a minute, while a group of musicians in the background provide what's generously called orchestral accompaniment, although there are only about 6 of them. As you see there. And the orchestras of famous conductors will play their stirring tunes 1,000,000 times after their horns and violins have been lost or broken. And we see a recording orchestra of 1923 grouped very tightly around the recording horn because the power of the sound from their instruments has to cut the record directly, no amplification. Unfortunately, in achieving no amplification, a lot of mechanical resonances were involved. Now I'll stop the film just there, and you'll see There are horns on those violins. What they are Stroh amplifying violins. Very shrewish sounding instrument, not much bass to them. But they were characteristic of recording studios where they needed a lot of sound power. And of course, an ordinary violin couldn't compete in volume with a trumpet or a trombone. Consequently, these Stroh violins were commonly used in the days before electrical recording came in, when mixing became possible. What strange magic causes the spirit of music to spring to life at our command from a box of wood and steel? Very flowery, these intertitles. When a stone is thrown in the water, it forms the centre of ever-widening circles of waves. In a somewhat similar way, sound produces waves or vibrations in the air. And thus we get into the world of illustration. And out go the waves from the source. And you can see by animation here that from Rosa Poncelli's mouth is coming the sound waves that are being collected by the horn on the left for mechanical recording. And there is a diagram of the mechanical recorder, extremely simple, not much removed from Edison's cylinder. The sound waves are concentrated down onto a little disc. A blank of wax makes a running record of these waves, like a graph, the first impressions of the singer's voice. Now there's the swarf, as it's called, the cuttings from the groove of the record coming off. And here by diagram we see that a wax blank was used to record. There was a recording head, and the recorder had a disc of very thin glass, like microscope slide cover glass, levered to a cutting tool which was attached that way to the diaphragm. The waves of sound are captured by the horn and move the sensitive diaphragm. There's Rosa Poncelli again, singing for all her worth. And that's what she does to the diaphragm of the recording head after the sound has been funneled down the horn. The cutting tool moves with the diaphragm and carves an undulating groove in the revolving disc of wax. This is VK3AML with the regular Saturday night test transmission. You can see the wavy line cut in wax, which is a graph of the sound waves of Rosa Poncelli's voice. The surplus wax is shaved off in fine hairs or swarf as the groove is cut. And there you see it all just wafting away. Other companies actually used a vacuum cleaner to get rid of it. I'm not joking. When the wax disc has become a record, it is played to test it for flaws. This is with a special, extremely lightweight playback head, and you can see that the recording director and the musical director are there discussing the balance of the instruments recorded. A reproducing needle travelling in the grooves of the wax vibrates another diaphragm which sends forth sound waves identical with those that are carved in these grooves. Well, identical, that's very optimistic. There you see the reproducing needle, and it's guided by the grooves to reproduce the vibrations of the diaphragm, which are connected to the surrounding air by the horn. The horn wasn't an amplifier, by the way. It didn't have any extra energy put in. It just coupled the diaphragm to the surrounding air more efficiently. But the sound waves are not yet made imperishable. The precious wax master is packed with great care and sent to the record pressing factory. there's a carrying box, and there's the wax tablet, about 1 inch thick. That was the standard method of sound recording prior to about 1930, used by some studios for some time after as well. The wax master is first coated with powdered graphite. This is to render the surface electrically conductive. And in those days it was done with nothing more complex than a pad. You just dust the wax master with graphite and rub it in. It's then placed in an electroplating bath which deposits a thin copper coating on it. This is to make the metal master a negative record. That is, a piece of metal with grooves, with ridges instead of grooves. After a 24-hour bath, a thin copper shell has formed on this wax master. So we go from the wax master to the metal master. Guys looking at the metal on the wax. This shell, called the metal master, is then stripped from the wax, and you'll see how it's done here. With a sort of a lever, and it pops off, and there's your negative record, a disc with ridges. But it's not used to press records immediately. The metal master carries a reversed impression of the sound waves. And there you see a diagram of it. There's the wax master at the bottom, and the metal plated on it at the top, which is then stripped away from the wax so that we have a permanent impression of the sound grooves in metal. Usually copper in those days. That's one of the reasons it couldn't be used for pressing, because copper would oxidize very readily. In the electroplating bath, it receives a copper coating that carries the sound impressions in grooves like those in the wax. What they're making here is what's called the metal mother. The mother record is like a grooved record, can be played, usually made of nickel. And the idea of the mother is that this will form the impression, a duplicate of the wax master, from which stampers of a durable material can be made. The process is not yet completed. The mother matrix must also receive a metal shell with the sound waves again in reverse. And there's the stamper. The metal master and the mother matrix form imperishable records of the singer's voice and are filed for future use. If only we had the files of most record companies. Most record companies at the advent of microgroove threw out their 78 masters. The final stamper shell is soldered to a heavy brass disc backing and is then ready for use in the making of records. And here you see solder. They drop the stamper onto it, put a weight on top of that, and therefore it's on a solid flat backing. Records are stamped from a plastic compound in a hydraulic press. The plastic compound in those days was a mixture of shellac and slate dust with what they call barytes, that is barium sulfate, very heavy powder, very fine powder but very heavy. It's actually used as a radiopaque for radiology. You swallow it and it outlines your gut in an X-ray. Barytes, barium sulfate. The music lives again in our homes, and here we see just one of those American homes with the record and appreciative, one hopes, listeners in 1923. Well, that was the situation when recording was an entirely mechanical process. By 1928, electric recording with double-button carbon mics and the Western Electric Recorder had become general. And this is a documentary of Columbia Records in Wandsworth, Earlsfield, England. Originally appeared on a channel called Topclassical back in the early 2000s and then disappeared. It was at that stage in very poor nick, lots of discoloration. The image was very improperly reproduced. I've tried to make the best of it here. The first step in the production of a record is the manufacture of the wax recording disc. And here you'll see it being made. Samples of all materials are first tested by chemists. I should mention Columbia Records was one of the three big companies of the 1920s, particularly in England: Columbia, HMV, Edison. And there are the chemists all going through their compounds. Boiling the raw wax, which is filtered and poured into moulds. And there's the heated tank, and they're filling it with stearine, pouring it into a bath of, would you believe, caustic soda. It then forms a metallic soap. These guys have to be careful of both the fumes and the material because it's heavily corrosive. And that's the wax pouring out of that vat. Now the guy heats a patty pan of tin with a gas hot blower, and then the man with the ladle of wax ladles it into that flat round tin to produce a disc of wax about 1 inch thick. He again sprays it with hot gas, and then after cooling one can just take the tablet out of that patty pan because it shrinks a bit from the sides. And that lady with the Eton crop is handling the wax. The wax is roughly trimmed in a lathe, special lathe with a large diameter head. And you'll notice that the wax is running vertically. That's so that when she shaves the surface to provide a sheen surface for the recording to be cut onto, that the wax can fall away from the face of the disc. If they did it horizontally, it couldn't. Interesting detail. And then it's highly polished in a special machine, the wax master. This is the polishing machine, another stage of producing a very fine recording surface. It was very difficult in those days to produce a master wax that didn't have any bubbles in it, and occasionally they'd have to spoil a take because the needle would run through to an undisclosed bubble just below the surface of the wax. Very circuitous method of recording, but the only one available at that time. The lady is examining the wax master disc, and now with a heated number on that sort of a stylus thing, she's putting the matrix number onto the disc, which gets put into a special felt-lined container. Let's follow the wax to the recording studio. And this is in a Columbia recording studio. In a moment you'll see Stokowski conducting his own Petrushka ballet. Notice, please do not attempt to enter this room while the red light is glowing, and there's a good reason why. If we look up, though, I don't think any light is glowing. In any case, could we tell that it's red in a black and white film? Studio 2. There's the Western Electric amplifier to drive the cutting head. The microphone, double button carbon. The recording wax is placed on the electric recording machine. This is a very interesting type of machine, a holdover from the acoustic recording days. There's the cupboard full of master waxes. You can imagine how much investment is based in those waxes. I believe the waxes could cost up to £30 each, so they didn't record things without a good reason. And there's the recording machine driven by a falling weight with the governor on the left. And in this recording machine there's the amplifier, produced maybe 10 watts of undistorted audio to the recording head, and the recording proceeds. And it's Stokowski. There's the vacuum cleaner tube to get rid of the swarf, the Western Electric rubber line recording head, which is fixed, the turntable. And here's Stokowski, and we've identified the disc he's recording, which you can hear. I think I've almost got this in sync. And sorry, I should have said it's Stravinsky, not Stokowski. Stravinsky's Petrushka. Igor Stravinsky. The 1928 recording of the Petrushka Ballet, which they've captured there, and I think they captured it in 3 discs of 2 sides each. There's the beautiful master wax. There was also a lighter side to recording, dance music of course, and this is, I think, Ray Starita's orchestra from the Ambassadors in London. And we can see what it's doing to the amplifier. There's the recording disc with the Western Electric rubber line recorder, and here are some clearer pictures of that recorder, that very recorder. The falling weight governor is on the left. That's an original 1925 picture of a Western Electric disc cutter of that type. The turntable moved slowly sideways, but the recording head was fixed. It was the reverse of what we do now. The recording head now, the cutting head is made to move across the disc while the turntable remains stationary. But this is technology that's held over from the days of mechanical recording, where it was difficult to actually move the recording head and the horns. That's the HMV equivalent, I think. Western Electric amplifier at the back. That's HMV Studio in London with their version of the Western Electric recorder, slightly different, but still driven by a falling weight. And this is a 16-inch disc recorder used for early talking pictures in Hollywood. Very similar, also built by Western Electric, but entirely electrically driven so that it could be synchronized with a film camera. Slightly different requirements. That's the first disc recorder in Melbourne with electrical recording at Vocalion Studios. And back to the Wandsworth recorder, where we see the recording engineer finishing off his recording. The horn on the right, incidentally, is for trial playback. It's not the recorder. That's the recording head he's lifting now. Now watch, he moves the whole turntable to one side. The turntable moves, not the recording head. And he looks very carefully at the grooves to see that there's no lip at the side of the grooves, which would make it impossible to separate a metal impression from the master wax. Other guys in the recording booth looking closely at that wax to make sure that it's right, because of course they've hired an orchestra of 50 musicians with Stokowski, or maybe 10 with Ray Starita. The recorded wax is carefully examined, and you'll see he puts it under a microscope to see that there are no glitches, no blowholes, burst bubbles in the wax. There you can see the sound recording wobbles in the groove that represent a graph of the sound made by the various orchestras. Pops the wax master back into the felt box, and now we prepare the wax master record to obtain a copper negative, as we saw in the earlier Victor Records example. This is the British Columbia example some years on. And here you'll see the most primitive aspect of disc preparation at that time, which desperately needed improvement. To render the surface electrically conductive, you'd first put a metal band around the wax master. Okay, that's fair enough. But now to make it conductive, it's the most primitive process you could imagine, and it does add noise to the recording process. They scrub powdered graphite into the wax, literally scrub it by hand using pads, which you can see there. Pour a bit more on, Fred. Here we go. Yeah, just dump the graphite all over the wax and scrub it in. That'll cause another 10 dB of less Sigda noise in the result. But in those days of mechanical playback on wind-up gramophones, did anybody care? Probably not. It gives us something to restore, to enhance the Sigda noise with digital equipment. So they put the conductive wax onto a bar, which then is treated further. I think they washed the disc off with distilled water to make sure that no residual graphite grains are left on it. The graphite is in the surface of the record, one hopes, as a mono layer, but it probably was a bit more rough than that. It's immersed for 16 hours in an electroplating bath, which has that agitator action that you see there. Here it is, the wax master disc with the graphite surface. They hang it on, I think, the negative terminal, and a copper negative is formed by electric action on the wax, which has now finished its task. In fact, most wax masters were discarded or shaved for a new recording after they were recorded. Wash it off again with distilled water, and there's the copper master matrix, which he's about to take off. He removes the metal band around the wax and separates, if he's lucky, the copper master with negative grooves, ridges rather than grooves, and hopefully doesn't damage too much in the process. The original copper negative record is used to produce other negatives called shells. And they do this with another step. They produce what's called a mother record from that master, which is like a record with grooves but metal. And then from that they will produce in nickel, which can withstand high temperatures and pressure, the actual stampers that are used in the record presses. This is the separation of the master copper from the nickel mother record. Beautiful, aren't they? I've seen mother records, the few that survive from Columbia in Homebush. There are a few in the National Film and Sound Archive. Very pretty they are too, and generally because they're nickel, they haven't oxidised in the ensuing 95 years. And there they are, putting them into protective sleeves, and they'll be sent to filing. So, in sequence from the left: metal master, mother, stamper, stamper. Or it could be wax master, metal master, mother and stamper. Some views of a Columbia electro deposition plant, and they were massive. They were producing a huge number of records for a world market from their factory in Earlsfield, Wandsworth in southern London. Imagine the amount of electric power required for all that electroplating. There are the AC to DC converters. They didn't have reliable rectifiers for high current in those days, so they had Jenny motors, big Jenny motors, producing DC by generation. The original copper negative records are placed in covers and stored in fireproof vaults. And there are the girls with the fireproof vaults. All this is in 1928. And hopefully some of these would have been preserved, though I believe that when Columbia merged with HMV to form EMI in 1931, for some reason best known to themselves, HMV discarded most of the masters, so now we only have pressings of many of their records. Now we shall see how the final record pressing is made. And don't worry, the pictures get better. Preparing the material, that is, the material that's pressed. All Columbia records are 3-ply laminated pressings having superfine non-scratch surfaces. Well, they weren't completely non-scratch, they were just lower in noise. And this shows a section of a Columbia record, their laminated product, a tough core with a very fine shellac and barytes surface, which was much lower in noise than most, background noise. The surface material is mixed on a steam-heated roller and after cooling is pulverised. And of course for a record surface the pulverising had to go down to very fine dust level. And notice the guy isn't wearing a gas mask, and there's probably lots of hazardous material floating about there. Not to mention the fact that if he gets his finger in there, he gets sucked through the machine. Not very nice. And he's wearing probably white asbestos gloves because he's having to handle molten material, molten shellac, slate dust and other materials. So this would have been dirty, hot, horrible work. But then that was the nature of 1928. One of the huge grinding machines that grinds the shellac and the slate dust and the barytes all together. I believe that they call these Banbury mixers for some strange reason. There were the big hoppers with the dust coming down. This guy is putting bits of slate and sheet shellac into a grinding machine, and there at the end of the process they take the ground materials out. You'll see how finely divided it is when this guy puts his hand in it, like dust. I wouldn't like to be breathing that muck. But then workers were not very well protected at that stage. Another grinding machine, all driven by overhead belting, highly hazardous. The discs are covered with the superfine surface material. This is craft paper discs in the Columbia laminated pressing case that were coated with a very fine layer of finest shellac and powder. And you'll see the ladies putting the surface material discs on their paper backings onto that conveyor belt. See what happens to those later on. The discs in those days were not homogeneous and one layer like they were in the days of pressing vinyl. This was a 3-ply process. The fine surface was a very dirty material, as you see. The core material, while hot, is rolled out and formed into small slabs. The core material provided the strength, the backing for the record. And these slabs are called in the trade biscuits, for reasons that should be obvious. but I wouldn't like to eat them, particularly not at about 150 degrees Celsius, which this guy takes pride in actually handling briefly. On this conveyor belt, it's cooled and broken into squares or biscuits. And here it comes, the hot, pliant, viscous material, which will form the core of the Columbia discs, 78 RPM discs, and they've all been almost sliced into little squares, which that guy breaks up and puts aside. And they're sent off to the press. Printing Columbia labels. Of course, the labels for the discs had to be pressed offset, which you see here. There's a typical Columbia record with the Magic Notes trademark on it. Many of you may have seen the 78s with that trademark on them. There are still quite a few of them around in second-hand stores. Each record is moulded in hydraulic presses under a pressure of 60 tonnes. And you'll see the 60 tonnes in a moment. The copper negative is now fitted into the hydraulic press. It's copper backing, nickel plated, so it can withstand high pressure and temperature without oxidation. Centre the pressing by centering that. Put a clamp around the edge so that it's all nicely against the press plate. And the presses used by Columbia are a little different to what they had later. They would circulate very hot water, steam, through those presses. Here we go. You'll see the process. Label surface 1, core biscuit label 2, and then into the press, which is steam heated with a lot of pressure. And out comes the final disc. He's assembling the disc parts. First label, core, second disc surface, label, and then into the press. Label down, surface 1, central core biscuit, surface 2, upper label, into the press, temperature and pressure. And there's the pressure, a bloody great weight above the building, which is mechanically driven down on the press. And out comes a Columbia disc with a lot of trimmings that have to be taken off it. Label, bottom surface, label, so it goes. Bottom surface, biscuit, core biscuit, upper surface, label. A view of some of the presses. And as you can see, ladies are packing the completed records after inspection, while the guys on the right are the pressmen. There are frequently 100 or more presses in the factory, turning out an enormous number of discs per day. They sold around 4 and 6pence per disc, so they'd have to sell a lot to make a profit. These are the oil-fired furnaces that are used to produce the heat in the Columbia factory. Massive things. They look like they're out of the boiler room of the Titanic. At each stage of manufacture, every record is examined. And here are ladies flipping through one record after another, and they're trained to look for defective grooves, defective pressing, defective label. I used to know an inspector from the Vocalion factory here in Melbourne who had souvenired quite a few of defective pressings, which paradoxically now are the only copies of those records surviving, which I digitised. And here the ladies are performing a listening test in little booths on wind-up gramophones. They probably only test about one record in 20, but it's enough. Periodical tests are also made of the materials, and this guy is putting a disc into a stressing device with a screw to apply pressure, and you can see the spring gauge is showing how much pressure the record can take before it snaps. The idea being to increase the strength of the product so that they didn't have so many breakages in transit, which also always were a cost. There's the 3-layer record, the 3-ply record, 2 fine surfaces, a thick central core, and craft paper separating. The edges and surfaces are polished and the records are placed in their envelopes. This is VK3AML test transmission, 4th of June 2022, so if you want to look at the video that's accompanying my voice, Google VK3AML 4 June 2022. They're the ladies edging the records very quickly, with an advert for the Columbia Cricket Club ball on the wall. We've been able to date this film to about June 1928 for a whole variety of reasons. It was the only time that Stravinsky recorded at Columbia in Britain around that period, so we can date it fairly accurately. Girls polishing the records. Finished records are conveyed to the stockroom. Before the days of motorised forklifts. And up the records go for dispatch. And there's the boxing room. A lot of girls all getting RSI bunging records into boxes in piles of about 20 to 50. They're checked, boxed and sent to the dispatch department. Remembering that at this time Columbia in Britain serviced an enormous number of countries, including British possessions, which then included India and, of course, Australia. And quite a few of these Columbia discs still turn up in second-hand stores today after even 90 years. During the late 1920s there was a boom period in the production of records. This lady is stapling boxes for the Columbia discs. A foot stapler. And here the smaller Columbia boxes are being sorted. Some will go into even bigger boxes still. Down the chute, you can see how they fractured a few. And some of these are packed into wooden cases and dispatched to all corners of the earth. With what looks like wood shavings, which was necessary for these fragile old shellac discs. The Columbia discs weren't quite as fragile as HMV at that stage, but they still could suffer breakage. That one's going to Johannesburg via Algoa Bay, South Africa. We'll see other destinations shortly. Stockholm, Constantinople, shipped in all directions around the world, all with the Magic Notes trademark on the box. And off in your Rio delivery van. I think this is a procession of Columbia vehicles. I can't imagine they all lined up like this every day. Even a motorcycle sidecar delivered them. So with the day's work over, the workers hear the whistle and head off work. And you'll see from the number involved how big this Columbia Earlsfield factory was in London. Hundreds of workers employed in this industry. All unfortunately being exposed to what really were dangerous processes in many cases. And then the sold records go out to teenagers. That's trouble in every generation. Hey Mabel, have you seen the latest Ray Starita record? Let's put it on the gramophone. Never mind that that's a test pressing label. Mr. Starita himself. Now we move on to 1942, when there were improved matrix preparation and plating techniques. They got rid of that dreadful graphiting.
And I saw records made, music literally written in wax. The first step, I learned, is to pour a thin layer of molten wax onto a hot plate, the beginning of the master record. A hot flame melts all bubbles and flaws out of the wax, which is of the purest possible grade. This is done in a sealed, dust-proof and air-conditioned room where the temperature is thermostatically controlled. A second going over with the flame, and the wax is ready for slow and careful cooling, almost ready for the recording of the music. Meticulous examination ensures smooth perfection before the wax is passed through a special slot to the recording room. The perfect wax is put on the turntable, a cutting point called a stylus is adjusted, and everything is ready to record again the most popular selection ever caught on wax, the beautiful Blue Danube Waltz of Johann Strauss. The sound engineer is ready. The musicians are set. And I see a record made. The engineer mixes the sound to achieve the best musical balance in the record. The vibrations of sound brought from the microphones pass through this cutting head to the stylus. The stylus, in turn, cuts the vibrations in the soft wax, records the poetic tones forever. When the recording is finished, the soft disc is washed with nitrogen and put into a chamber with a block of pure gold. A 2500-volt electrical current, I was amazed to learn, bombards atoms of gold onto the wax, coating it completely. The gold-covered disc is put into a solution of copper sulfate, through which a powerful electrical current runs, transferring molecules of copper from the solution to the record. As a result of this process, called electrolysis, the disc comes out plated with copper. Immortal music written in metal. In a second bath, the copper coating is further built up. In these baths, electricity flows through the solution between two poles, one a block of copper and the other the disc itself. When the current passes from the copper into the solution, it carries with it charged molecules of metal called ions, which are drawn to the disc and penetrate its tiniest recesses, taking the exact shape of the grooves made by the original sound vibrations, ensuring perfect fidelity of tone in the final record. From this furiously bubbling cauldron comes the master record. After the copper has taken the impression, the wax may be stripped away. This master matrix now could be used to press the final records, I was told, but it would not last long enough to turn out the millions of discs music lovers demand. Hence another disc called a mother matrix must be made first, and from that, stampers will be made to press the final records. When the master is finally stripped, the last traces of wax are washed away. The master matrix is carefully rinsed and scrubbed. Then it's given another electrolytic bath, this time of nickel, which I learned gives it a still harder outer coating. After this bath, the master is washed and dipped into a special solution that coats it with a fine film. Now into another copper bath, and this time the mother matrix starts to build up on the face of the master, taking the shape of the same grooves, capturing again the sweet tones of the flowing music. The double disc is now separated into mother and master, and the master matrix goes down to the treasure house of music to be preserved for all time, to take its place beside the works of the world's greatest artists. The mother matrix is thoroughly washed and cleaned and goes into a nickel bath to give it a more durable surface. After another washing and film coating, it goes into another copper bath where the stamping matrix starts to build up. The double disc bubbles in its bath until the tiny electrified particles of copper grow into a hard, strong coating, and the plating is finished. Now the mother matrix and stamper, locked face to face, are separated. From the mother, additional stampers will be made so that many finished records may be pressed at one time. Before the stamper is ready to use, it receives a nickel plating and then another coat, this time of hard gleaming chromium to give it resistance enough to last through many pressings. The matrix is washed once more, and now with other stampers, it will soon be ready to press the finished records. For still greater strength, the completed matrix is soldered to a rigid backing. For perfect contact with the hot backing, the stamper is heated with flame, protected with a chemically neutral blanket, and pressed evenly into the hot solder. When the gleaming disc is removed from the press, it is ready for the next operation, the centering of the hole around which the finished record will revolve. This delicate mechanism centers the hole with meticulous precision and is checked by magnification.
One would hope that more companies would have done that, but the number of swinging discs eccentrically pressed that I've come across you would not read about, and they sound horrible. This is VK3AML. If you want to look in on the video accompanying this audio on 147.475 megs, please Google VK3AML for June 2022. That should bring up the YouTube stream. That phrase again, VK3AML for June 2022. Back to announcer Milton Cross, taking us for a tour of RCA Victor's pressing plant in 1942.
Looking through the magnifier, I saw the rotating grooves of the music itself caught on the record. Carefully, the technician centers the disc, and with the lens, he checks again. With the position of the hole accurately determined, he drills it with infinite accuracy on dead center. Now the stamper is given a last washing so no speck of dust can make even the tiniest mark that would create the smallest false sound. On this revolving cleaning machine, I saw the disc receive its final polishing.
She's polishing out the sound. Ooh!
But before going to the actual pressing of records, I was shown the mixing of the materials that go into the disc you hear at home. Ingredients gathered from the farthest corners of the earth. The materials are processed in one of the largest and most intricate machines I have ever seen, the Banbury mixer. One ingredient is the finest shellac obtainable, which is brought from India. Another resin ingredient is from the East Indies and, like the shellac, is ground into fine powder before mixing. "18 other ingredients gathered from distant places are carefully and accurately weighed in to ensure the most exact proportions to make a correct final mixture. All ingredients are finely ground and put into the mixer to be carefully combined under heat with the powdered shellac, which is sucked into the machine through a vacuum pipe. Now all is ready and the Banbury mixer rolls. Inside this huge machine, 3 stories tall, the mixture is heated to the melting point, whipped and stirred and beaten until it is thoroughly mixed to a dough-like consistency. The hot mixture falls out on great rollers where it is kneaded and rolled into a long, flat sheet. As it comes out of the machine, circular knives cut it into pieces called biscuits, each the right size to make one record. The biscuits, cooled for easy handling, come off the belt in neat little piles, but before they are used for actual pressing, they must be heated again on steam tables. Then I saw a record pressed. First, steam is shot through the machine. Then cold water runs through to cool the record. Two different stampers are used in the machine at the same time to press the 2 sides of the record simultaneously. The labels are put in before the biscuit, I learned, and actually pressed into the record, not just pasted on. Many presses working at the same time turn out many records together to satisfy the music-hungry thousands.
And please note, these presses are being almost all run by women. Why? Because it's 1942. America has entered the war. The men are off at the battlefront. Interesting. Back to the documentary. This is VK3AML.
The edge of the record is carefully polished. After this is finished, comes a listening test, when the record is actually played for expert ears.
And at this point, we leap forward to 1956, and a lot of things had happened to the recording industry by then. Everything you've seen so far of disc recording has been done at 78 RPM, with 12-inch discs running 4 minutes or 10-inch discs running 3 minutes per side, basically singles, all of them, unless you wanted to get a complete opera on about 20 discs with 40 sides. However, in 1956, as a result of research in the late 40s, microgroove long-play discs, 33 and 45 RPM, had been introduced. The mastering was no longer direct-to-disc, it was done on magnetic tape, usually on 10-inch nab spools going at either 15 or 30 inches per second. In the mid-50s, stereophony, 2 channels in a single groove, was made available. You'll see a bit of that in this documentary. Variable pitch groove cutting on the LPs allowed longer than normal playing time. We'll see a bit of that. They varied the pitch according to the amplitude of the audio at that particular point in the disc. And pressing was no longer done on shellac mixtures with slate dust and barytes as it had been in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. It was done in homogeneous vinyl, a much more quiet material that was capable of taking much finer details from the metal stampers. So let's have a look at the improvements in the recording industry in 1956. Unfortunately, the colour in this documentary is rather faded. This is VK3AML.
A new orthophonic high-fidelity recording is not just the mechanical reproduction of a concert performance. It's the art of creating the effect of a concert performance. There are many stops and starts, many takes and retakes. That's because the end object is a planned illusion. The illusion, as you ultimately hear the music played back through your phonograph, that you have the best seat in the concert hall. How do they do it? Well, the recording music director or any one of the sound engineers could easily explain it all in 10 weeks. But let's just take a look at 3 of the fundamental requirements of high-fidelity recording. The first is full dynamic range. That's the spread between the softest and loudest passages in the music. In a concert performance, the range is as wide as the conductor feels the score indicates. These meters on the recording console indicate the volume of sound coming from the orchestra onto the magnetic tape. In the old days, home phonographs could not reproduce either full loud passages or very soft passages. So they were literally kept off the record right here by sound monitoring. But it wasn't a faithful reproduction of the actual performance, such as you get with today's high-fidelity recording techniques. Today, as it should be, the conductor and his musicians control all of the dynamics, including all of the natural shadings, just as they do in a concert. And after the recording begins, the engineer never touches the controls. The full dynamic power of the orchestra is faithfully transferred to the recording tape. The second requirement is somewhat similar, achieving natural balance between all instruments and sections of the orchestra. This can only be achieved by precise microphone placement. And this varies amazingly with the music, the particular artists, the hall itself, even climatic conditions. It is never the same from one recording session to another. Again, an easy solution might be found here by the arbitrary placement and control of many microphones. But again, it wouldn't be natural or faithful reproduction. Today, the engineers record the orchestra as a complete unit. The third important requirement in a high-fidelity recording is frequency range, capturing high notes as well as low. This is actually accomplished before the session begins. All it takes is recording equipment of enormous cost and capacity, such as this recording console. It faithfully handles all sounds audible to the human ear. The entire frequency spectrum from 20 to 20,000 cycles per second. And with less than 0.2% distortion, it transfers them to the swiftly spinning magnetic tape. A new challenge here is stereophonic recording. This requires dual mics, dual track tape machines, and a stereophonic mixer. But for those who have the equipment, it also permits two-system or stereophonic playback in the home. There are other high-fidelity requirements, such as presence, definition, clarity. But with time and patience and enough retakes, they get on the record too. Eventually, there is a playback that everyone recognizes as the image they were seeking, both artistically and acoustically. They have a truly faithful recording of Romeo and Juliet. And we are one step closer to having it in our homes. Next stop, New York City, and the precise engineering business of transferring the recorded sound from tape to a disc called the lacquer master. This disc is the grandfather of the records to come later. Let's look at the steps in the cutting of our lacquer master. Most of the sound factors are already known. The speed of the tape in recording, its playing time, and the sound level required. These factors must be considered for both 45 RPM and long play lacquer masters. A special lacquer master disc is closely inspected. For the 12-inch long play record, the master is 16 inches in diameter. For 45 extended play records, the master is 12 inches in diameter. In both cases, the extra width allows plenty of working room in cutting. Besides a spindle for centering, the turntable has a number of holes. Through these holes, air suction holds the lacquer disc down tightly, so it is perfectly flat on the turntable. The playing time of the music determines the number of grooves per inch that will be cut into the record. The sound dynamics of the music determine how far apart the grooves must be. Loud passages need more space between grooves. Soft passages need less. The cutting machine automatically spaces the music grooves according to the sound signal it's receiving. Now, a test cut to determine the groove width. The groove width must be exact, so exact that it is carefully checked through a microscope. Everything's set, and a coarse pitch lead-in groove is cut to the music area. The tape machine is started, and exactly 1.5 turns before the music begins, the cutting head automatically changes from the lead-in groove to fine pitch music grooves. The cutting stylus is a minute piece of sapphire, perfectly ground and electrically heated, so there is virtually no resistance as it cuts into the smooth lacquer. During the cutting operation, a constant watch is kept on the groove width to make sure it never varies from the prescribed setting. It all sounds so simple when you're just skimming the surface. Actually, of course, it's a painstaking and delicate operation. But in time, you have a perfect lacquer master. The original tape goes into the vault for safekeeping, to take its place forever alongside many other priceless performances by the world's greatest artists.
Or so one would hope. This is VK3AML testing. I see we've got a quarter of an hour I wasn't expecting to have to fill, up to 11 p.m. We actually received a copyright notice that the Edison documentary, the oldest of the material that I presented tonight, was under copyright, so I switched to another early item, namely the one of Rosa Poncelli. And the copyright infringement notice ceased, so you never can tell what's under copyright and what's not. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima. Well, as I have another 10 minutes to fill before we go for a QSO, with hopefully a few people making comments or starting a discussion of some kind, I'll bring up a documentary that I find rather fascinating. Others might not. And of all things, it's about the manufacture of power lines. I thought this would be terribly, terribly dry. This is shot in the early 1940s or the late 30s, I'm not sure. But This, to me, is an absolutely fascinating piece of filmmaking, and I had no idea that the manufacture of copper cables was such a hypnotic thing to watch. So, we give you...
I am an engineer. I find beauty in modern power stations and the pylons and wires that stretch over the face of Britain. I am proud, too, of the fact that per head of the population, Britain has a greater mileage of cable than any other country in the world.
I'm the man in the street. I think of electricity as revolutionizing old customs and habits on the farm, in the factory, and in the home.
But as an engineer, let me remind you that for all these purposes, a different cable is necessary, from the supertension oil or gas-filled cable bringing power to a city, to the simple piece of flex bringing light to a reading lamp. Today, whether the generating station is to supply a manufacturing town, a housing estate, or a rural area, we must first plan where the cable shall be laid and determine the course of the main arteries which are to carry electric power to the members of the community.
And here they are, laying one of the ever-growing networks of cables and wires which travel beneath the street or over the fields, and sometimes beneath the waters of rivers, lakes, and seas, bringing heat, light, power, and communications to every house, office, factory, theatre, cinema, farm, and village. What romance lies there in those tunnels underneath the streets on which we walk?
This is a cross-section of the main cable. The copper conductors in the center are the paths along which immense power passes. The other layers, impregnated paper insulation, lead sheath, armoring, and outer covering are for insulation and protection purposes. The copper from which the wire is made, in vast quantities, comes mainly from Rhodesia, and in the form received is known as blister copper. The blister copper is melted and refined in the furnace, the temperature attained being approximately 2,100 degrees Fahrenheit. This crane, operated with great skill by its driver, loads the copper into the furnace. The charge amounts to about 200 tons. Is that a picture?
It certainly is.
After the copper has been melted, the refining operation is commenced. Air is blown into the molten metal to oxidize the impurities. These are formed into slag, which is frequently skimmed from the surface of the metal bath. Finally, green trees are forced into the molten metal to reduce the copper oxide formed during refining. This operation is known as poling.
In the same way as eggshells make soup clear, I take it.
It takes about 24 hours to complete the melting and refining operations and bring the metal to the correct condition for tapping. The molten copper is cast into wire bars in these molds, which are made to move automatically so that there is no break in the pouring.
Like coffee cups on a quick service counter.
As the molds leave the lips of the ladle, they travel slowly down until they get to the point where they're automatically tipped. The wire bars are dumped into the water. From there, they're automatically conveyed to an inspection table. Pneumatic hoists lift them into trucks which carry them to the rolling mill, where they're reheated until they're red hot prior to rolling. The wire bars are then reduced to quarter-inch rod by passing at great speed through a series of grooved rolls.
You just can't describe the effect in words. Let the music do it. happening now?
This is the black rod being lowered into an acid bath to be pickled to remove scale and oxide, emerging copper red. It now goes to the wire drawing plant, where it is first drawn down on these machines, carrying dies of decreasing diameter to small dimensions. Similar machines with diamond dies draw wires to even smaller sizes. This wire is finer than a human hair. Now the larger wires are stranded to form cores of various sizes.
It's good to find occasionally, among so much that's ugly in industry, a manufacturing process such as this that looks so fascinating.
The most important process is the insulating, to enable the cable to hold the electricity within the conductor. For this purpose, layers of specially treated paper are lapped over the copper. If you look closely, you will see that this particular cable is not round, but oval-shaped. In a moment, we shall see the reason for this. Here, for instance, is a 4-core low-tension cable. The reason for the oval shape becomes apparent. It enables the cores forming the cable to lie snugly together without causing internal stresses. This high-tension cable has 3 cores and is assembled in the same way. The cores are neatly drawn together and taped. As the cable comes off this machine, it is wound directly onto a cable drum. The cable now goes into the impregnator to undergo a vacuum drying and impregnating process. This will take as long as a week. Let us look at some of the various types of wire undergoing other processes. Some wires are insulated with rubber. The wire is first tinned with a special tin alloy designed to preserve the insulation and facilitate soldering of joints. The rubber is first warmed and mixed through one pair of rollers. It then passes through a number of other rollers, which reduce it to the required thickness. This process is known as calendering. Some cables for special purposes, for instance cable for industrial plant and mines which need extra toughness, have rubber lapped onto them. Other wires for household purposes have rubber rolled onto them between grooved rollers. 3 layers of rubber can be distinguished here: white, black, and white. The longitudinal joints are sealed automatically as they are cut. Some wires are covered with rubber by the extrusion process. In all of these processes, the rubber is finally vulcanized. But rubber is not the only insulating agent. Plastics can also fulfill many of the functions of rubber in the insulation of this type of wire and cable. These are prepared in a similar way to rubber. The plastic is warmed and mixed and then calendered. Now it is extruded or squirted onto the wire to form a tough, hard-wearing insulation. This plastic-covered cable is braided with wire. It is to be used for high-frequency radio purposes. Another black plastic outer covering is extruded onto it before it is finally completed. Many fine wires are braided on these ingenious machines.
Isn't that like the way they knit stockings?
Yes, and the use of this wire is still a war secret.
And this looks like a maypole.
Yes, its flexibility allows it to be used for many household purposes. The power cable we left in the impregnator has had every vestige of moisture removed and has been filled with oil. It is now going to the lead extrusion press. It passes through this press, where it receives a sheath of lead, is cooled by water, and then wound directly onto the cable drum. The lead makes it completely waterproof. But the lead itself must be protected from damage, so the cable passes through a further machine, where it receives first a bituminous compound covering, then coverings of paper and hessian, or jute, as a bedding for the wire armor. The wire armoring receives a further covering of compound and hessian, or jute, and a final covering of whitewash to prevent it sticking on the drum. And so, the care with which all these coverings are applied protects the public against any possibility of breakdown in service. Copper for high conductivity, paper insulation to confine the immense power to the conductor, lead sheath for protection against moisture, armoring against mechanical damage, and a further outer protection. But still, scientists in the laboratory, having at their disposal the most advanced apparatus, are continually improving existing material and experimenting in the use of cable for new purposes. Let us watch for a moment this power cable that has received a new type of insulation. It is about to undergo a destruction test. This particular cable is designed to carry approximately 30,000 volts. But the voltage passed through it in this test goes up and up. Here we are at 30,000 volts. 100,000 volts. The cable still holds. 300,000 volts. 400,000 volts. It fails. At 400,000 volts. For a cable designed to take only 30,000 volts. The cable at this point of failure is carefully dissected. First, the sheathing is removed, and then the paper tapes are removed. These tapes are then impregnated with a special magenta dye, which enables the pattern of the breakdown to be traced out. This pattern can be read by the experts to give them the clue to the reason for the test breakdown.
Planning and reconstruction are in the minds of us all. We are thinking of the full application of electric power. Cables like this are being laid all day, every day, throughout the British Empire and in all the countries of the world. A cable like this, no thicker than a man's wrist, is capable of harnessing 140,000 horsepower.
I'll just interrupt that there to say this is VK3AML. We'll be opening for a QSO in about 2 minutes. VK3 Alpha Mike Lima, back to the documentary on the manufacture of British cables.
Power for business, education, light for shops and homes, power for factories, power for transport and communications, power in fact to benefit all in health, work and play. These things electricity can give through cables to Britain and the world.
And that was an example of wartime British documentary, and the movement that was led by John Grierson converted what could have been an appallingly boring documentary into musically and dramatically and artistically, in my humble opinion, a fantastic piece of documentary film. I must say, when I see things like that, I despair that nothing that I produced in my career could ever come up to that standard. It just... sorry, but I find that sort of filmmaking where a potentially dry subject is made interesting incredibly clever. And with that, I'll switch over to receiving, and we'll call CQ on 147.475, hoping nobody has been excessively aggravated by the musical backing to many of these films, which one tries to avoid but one can't. Fortunately, we live in a country with a Radio Communications Act that allows material of instructional value, if accompanied by music, to be run, particularly in a test transmission. So, on the basis that we receive no complaint, I continue. And there's no predicting where copyright problems can arise. All I can do is to work by the, I think, rather practical approach of seek forgiveness, not approval. Because I find that if one seeks approval, particularly from government departments, one spends months waiting for a reply as the message goes up the line of command. I think practicality dictates otherwise. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima. Now, I hope I'll change my... this is very unslick. My apologies, folks. I'm changing my monitoring from the radio, where I'm listening to my own transmission, to the mixer, where I can hear replies on 2 meters, and we're calling CQ. Do we have anybody for a discussion following that? VK3 Alpha Mike Lima now standing by on 147.475.
Yeah, VK3 ECG.
And VK3ACZ.
VK3 DLW.
We have VK3 ECG, VK3ACZ, hello Peter, and hello Dave, and hello VK3DLW. That's a good start. My apologies for not being able to run the full Edison documentary. There was some very interesting footage there, but I had no idea that that particular item was under copyright, and one can only go by the feedback one receives from the bots on YouTube live stream. So I terminated that very quickly and just jumped forward to the next item. I hope it didn't cause too much consternation, and I kept the cable documentary in reserve just in case. VK3 CG, Dave, VK3 Alpha Mike Lima, how's your week been and how are you?
Yeah, VK3AML, the group VK3 ECG. Well, I'm slowly improving, and good evening to Peter and Graham. Yes, still a bit of a cough here and there, but otherwise picked up reasonably well. A bit tired still, but to be expected, I suppose. Having got over all the symptoms now, at least hopefully I'm going to be free of things for the next sort of 12 weeks or so. But I suppose you can never tell. Fascinating tonight, Chris. That was absolutely wonderful, and I very much enjoyed just seeing the machines at work, I have to say. I mean, I know exactly what you mean by the sort of hypnotic effect of those certainly the knitted fabric around cables and those incredible machines for doing that, extraordinary. Remembers those sort of childhood crafts of making those weird little knitted tubes and things they made us do in kindergarten or whatever it was at the time, but absolutely fascinating. I rather like the idea of Edison's kids being called Dot and Dash. I think that must be hard to live that one down, yes, and just seeing some of those early instruments as well. I mean, not early instruments, but the amplified instruments with the violins with the horns on them and so on, which were very interesting. And in fact, a lot of interesting sort of effects of the movement of music historically, without nothing to do with recording as such, was that movement from the small orchestras of the early Baroque era to the later orchestras of the classical era, which got larger and so on, and a number of instruments just fell by the wayside simply because they couldn't cope with the volume of the larger number of players that started to appear in the sort of later Baroque orchestras, and so that in Bach's day the flute meant a recorder effectively, and the recorder was the main instrument, and it wasn't until later on that the cross-blown flute that we think of as a flute today sort of came in, and of course it had far more power and a great deal more expressive means of play and so on. So it's an interesting feature that instruments have changed and have always changed actually in their sound to meet the needs of the audience in effect and the needs of the composers. So yeah, amazing stuff. Sort of quite, it's interesting to see how people modified instruments to make them useful. I mean, Wagner even invented his own instruments to give him the sound he wanted, and things like that. So it would be quite fascinating. There's a few more things I think on the on that sort of music front and so on that I think come into that recording issue as well. I mean, the dynamic range is absolutely fascinating, and the limitations to the dynamic range that were there in those early recordings, say nothing of the limitations of frequency as well, and of course the ability to pull those things out now and to correct them to give a much fuller sound, of course, is fabulous, and you've done obviously a great job there. A couple of other things I really loved, the incredible dangers of some of those early manufacturing processes, which I am still utterly astonished by, and some of that powder, the powdered slate and the powdered barium sulfate and from the old barium meals and the shellac and so on. I mean, ground to powder would be fascinating to see what those things did to people, but I suspect any of the sort of silica slate type products would have been quite nasty, and resulted in quite a bit of pulmonary fibrosis and things like that. But fabulous stuff, and really just great to see those machines in operation. Anyway, back to you, Chris. VK3AML and the group VK3ECG.
I leave a gap for breakers. We rarely get them, unfortunately. Thanks, Dave. Edison had two families, as I understand it. His first family with the first wife, who died in, I think, 1880 or thereabouts, at the age of 29 from a brain tumour. None of them did very well, including Thomas Edison Jr. from that union, and most of them died fairly young. The second family, with Mina Edison, I think they married in the 1880s. The kids from that, one, Charles Edison, became a United States Senator. The youngest son, Theodore Edison, born in 1899, became a good theoretician, and in fact, after Edison retired from his own recording business in 1925, Theodore and Charles took over the recording business and switched to electrical recording using their own completely self-developed electrical recording process, completely circumventing Western Electric's various patents, which was no mean feat. Dangers of manufacturing. Well, it was at a time when all sorts of domestically hazardous chemicals and practices were around. I mean, mercurochrome for kids, and I can remember that stuff. Mercuric chloride or oxide of some kind put on scabs. What a way to cumulatively poison your children. And not to mention smoking. I mean, my goodness, if you weren't killed by the smoking, the stickiness of the surface of your lungs caused by smoking would make the dust from those industrial processes fix in the lungs to produce silicosis and God knows what. Not to mention the reactive materials. The most dangerous thing that I think I saw in any of those documentaries was the mixing of the compounds for the wax, the master wax tablet for recording in the 20s, was stearine, a kind of a white powder as I understand it, mixed into boiling caustic soda. Boiling caustic soda. A touch of that will dissolve flesh, let alone boiling. And it was an exothermic reaction, so as you put the stearine into the caustic soda, it would boil even more, perhaps splash even more. Frightening. I once met, many years ago, the guy who had been the electroplating expert for the first Melbourne-based pressing plant, and he gave me some photos of himself taken in the 1920s, the electroplating plant, and his fingernails in those photos were invariably black. He told me they weren't painful, they were just stained by the chemicals used in electroplating processes, probably caustic soda or something. Sorry, not caustic soda, what am I saying? If he'd done that, he'd have no fingers left at all. I'm talking about copper sulfate. Copper sulfate. So, around to Peter, and how's your week been, and how's your DX been, Peter? That'll always be the million-dollar question. VK3ACZ and group, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ returning. Good evening, Chris, Dave and Graham. Yes, there's been a bit of DX, but I'll get to that shortly. Talking to you on a new radio tonight. I had another radio follow me home from Ross's toy shop yesterday. Nothing extravagant or fancy, just a Yaesu FTM 300. A bit of a car portable. It's not going to be used primarily as that. It will go in the car occasionally, but I wanted something because my silly Yaesu 991 Alpha, if you change the repeater offset frequencies from 5 meg to 7 meg, as some of them are now doing on 70 centimetres, it changes everyone in the menu, so it's a bit of a nuisance. So what did I do? I spent till 3 o'clock this morning programming this one manually with all the repeaters and fancy frequencies I wanted. But anyway, if I sound terrible, please let me know. But anyway, Chris, I have to start with something of an explanation and or apology. I didn't catch any of your broadcasts tonight. I will be doing so as soon as we finish chatting here, especially as you've whetted my appetite a bit with the discussion so far, mentioning Edison and cables and all the rest of it. It sounds like a broadcast I mustn't miss. But I have a good excuse. Sandra insisted that I go with her to listen to the Salvo band playing at a big hall in Ringwood tonight, and a brass band. I forgot how good brass bands actually sound. They had 2 international famous singers join them, both of which names I no longer remember, but the male especially assured us all that he'd sung for the Queen. And speaking of that, GB70 Echo, I worked yesterday coming from Windsor in London. It's the special event station for the Queen's Silver Queen's Jubilee. Hope you're impressed, Dave. Hi. And I also got my first contact with Namibia, both on 20 metres yesterday, but what made it all the better for me was that he was beaming on the long path. So QRZ.com says that's 28,500 kilometres, so I was rather pleased with that. It turns out I've actually worked more African countries than I have South America at the moment, because I've only got 3 thus far in South America. But yeah, still early days. We're off on Monday to the Shoebrook radio camp up the other side of Dimboola, so sunspot conditions are not exactly ideal at the moment, but I hope to make some use of that. I got to say again, Chris, I'm so annoyed at myself for not getting back in time to hear your broadcast, but the absolute beauty of it, the standout achievement is that I can sit down later on and catch up. I just can't tell you about it at the time. But anyway, so good to have the QSOs afterwards. It's something that I look forward to every Saturday night. But back to you, Chris. VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ.
VK3ACZ and group VK3AML. Well, I know what you mean by the 5 to 7 meg change. For ages I tried to program the transmitter I'm speaking on, FT7900, for the 7 meg split, and I found that invariably I was mucking up everything else, like you say, until very kindly VK3... Michael Barrett, VK3EMB, came around with his chirp program, and we reprogrammed the whole radio so that with chirp you could program different frequencies for different spacings. But oh God, when they start doing that, when they start changing repeater offsets so that the offsets are no longer standard, oy vey, to use a Jewish expression. Salvo bands, yeah, I have quite a few friends in the Salvation Army. As you probably know, I worked a lot of my working life with film or sound archives, and one of the people I worked with closely was the guy who established the Southern Territories archives for the Salvation Army, George Ellis, who lives only about 3 streets away and is one of our closest friends. Not a Bible basher. I've yet to meet a salvo who is a Bible basher in the American evangelical way. They persuade by example rather than by harassment. I think that's the best description. And the Windsor Jubilee, I wonder which sort of Jubilee it is. This is one Jubilee more than Queen Victoria was able to have, and God knows she had a long enough reign from 1819, I think, to 1901. I think Queen Elizabeth has now exceeded that, as she's started reasonably young, not quite as young as Queen Victoria, but she's enjoyed much greater longevity than Queen Victoria. I think Queen Victoria was 83, 84 when she died, very early in 1901. So this would be not a silver jubilee, not a diamond jubilee, platinum maybe? I don't know. Maybe somebody might know. I'll hand it round to Graham, VK3DLW. Lovely to have you in, Graham, as rapidly seems to be becoming a regular, and thank you for saving us from the invidiousness of nobody to talk to. It's nice to have new people coming through, although you're not all that new. It's very much appreciated to have you there. VK3DLW in group VK3AML. I'm raving.
That's all right, Chris, you're entitled. VK3AML to rave, that is. VK3DLW in the group. Good evening, David and Peter as well. But yes, no, I got to catch all of it this evening, which was really fascinating. The footage of Edison, yeah, be interesting to catch up with it in some other way, perhaps. Fascinating history. He's quite vilified in some ways, but obviously was still quite brilliant. The days of the competition between AC and DC and his battles with Westinghouse were make fascinating reading as well. And this whole idea of electrocuting an elephant is just it's something that I just can't contemplate a world where that would be considered something that you would demonstrate. But anyway, that's apparently how things were. But ironically, and this is a bit off topic, but there are actually now high voltage links, and I guess this ties in with the cables, which are actually DC, because the efficiency of inverter technology has become such that it's efficient enough to do that, and the advantages of using DC for high voltage runs is actually sufficient to justify doing that. And I believe there are a number of power links in the US now which actually run DC, but that's a little bit off topic. And the other thing I'm interested in, when you see things like the fact that some records actually moved the stylus vertically, assuming the record's flat, rather than sideways, is interesting. I wonder how much mileage the vertical method got, because I just wonder if it was an early rerun of something like the competition between Sony and Toshiba on Blu-ray and HD DVDs, or maybe it just died very quickly. I don't know, and if it was VHS and Beta and all of those things that progressively, I guess I wouldn't say the market sorted them out, but certainly the advertising and the salesmanship won the day rather than necessarily technical superiority. Interesting what you were saying, David, about the customizing of instruments to suit the recording as well. And you could see quite a bit of that with the violin with the horn on it. Although I can't imagine what it did for the sound of the violin, but I guess when your recording process is that primitive, perhaps it's just it really doesn't make a difference. And the other interesting thing is, in my early days, my parents bought what at the time was a fairly modern radiogram, but it actually had an option for a speed of 16 and 2/3 RPM. Yet I never saw a 16 and 2/3 record, so I wonder if those ever existed and were ever marketed. Because it was sort of ready for them, but I don't think they ever entered the market, or I never saw one. So interesting. And one of the early things I did was a mono device, and I actually substituted the cartridge for a stereo cartridge, ran some extra wiring through the stylus arm and added an extra amplifier, and was gratified to hear my first playing of a stereo recording at home. So it brought back some of that history for me. Fascinating stuff. Anyway, back to you, Chris. VK3AML in the group VK3DLW.
No breakers. Okay. Well, taking last things first. The 16 and 2/3 speed was chiefly used for talking books and spoken word material in the late 50s, very briefly. Didn't really take off, as you may have gathered, although a lot of multi-speed record changer decks for radiograms made between 1955 and about 64 included the speed. I believe that you could get a reading in something like 15 LPs of the whole of the New Testament if you wanted it, but the idea of it was to replace an earlier system which existed in the 30s, 40s and early 50s of talking books for the blind. I've got a couple of them just as examples. A book called Angel Pavement by the same chap who wrote The Good Companions, J.B. Priestley. And it's recorded at 24 RPM. There were machines specifically made as talking book machines for the blind in that format. HMV pressed some, RCA Victor pressed some in a kind of a vinylite material. They were fairly noisy, speech-only kind of bandwidth, 3 kilohertz if you're lucky, but quite viable. I don't think they were ever used to a huge extent, but the blind, they were used in schools and such. But the labels, interestingly, are printed normally on one side, and if you flip over, there's Braille in raised pimples on the back. So, originally talking books for the blind, but they tried to launch talking books. The 16, and 2/3 speed could go about 40 minutes, I think, on a single side of a 12-inch disc. But eventually they were taken over by tape, because long play tapes could, particularly at 3 3/4 and 1 7/8 inch per second, could play considerably longer and with better quality. So the tape really killed 16 2/3. I believe that there were some 16 2/3 recordings made in Sydney too by one of the major manufacturers there. It could have been Spotlight, I'm not quite sure. Electrocuting an elephant, yes, that was filmed by Edison. I've actually seen the film. If you really feel masochistic, or if I feel sadistic, I can run the film of electrocuting an elephant. I've got a copy of it on video. Horrendous thing it was. It was an elephant that attacked its keeper, and they decided it had to be destroyed. So rather than give it a few bullets through the brain, Edison wanted to describe the lethality of AC power. So in the film you see the elephant being led onto 4 plates. The power is activated. A little bit of smoke comes up from the elephant's 4 feet. He goes very, very stiff and then falls over, kaplonk, with a loud thud, which wasn't recorded because it was silent film. But Edison was a bit of an oddbod. I have a huge amount of admiration for him as a businessman, as a self-promoter. Undoubtedly, particularly in his early days, he was hugely creative. He recognised creativity in other people. In fact, I think his best invention was the Menlo Park Research Lab, the first real prototype of all the industrial research labs that have come since. And I think rather too much is made of the DC versus AC debate. There has been a film on it, highly Baudelarized, highly fictionalized, and highly pro-Tesla. I would question why criticize Edison purely because he came up with DC distribution when he invented, to go with it, the whole distribution system, the wires, the plugs, the sockets, the switches, the generators, the lot. He didn't just invent the electric lamp, he invented everything that went with it. And his team developed each of the ideas to a commercially marketable stage. I just have to jiggle a mouse around there to get the title going every now and then. It has automatic cut-off on its screen. So, did Tesla develop an entire system? No, he came up with some good ideas, but I tell you what, after the turn of the century, a lot of Tesla's ideas were literally junk. Wireless transmission of electric power in all directions at a frequency of something like 150 to 200 kilohertz is just not on. It won't work. They have devised, as I showed a few weeks ago on this live stream, methods of transmitting power remotely, but it's as yet very inefficient, and it involves infrared lasers or high-power microwave beams, which are not the most desirable things to stand in front of. Neither would Tesla's very high-power, low-frequency stuff be. What else? DC link to Tasmania under Bass Strait. Yes, was aware of that. Bass link. I think it's failed only once or twice, and then because of shipping accidents, I think. Now, vertical modulation on gramophone discs was initially commercialised on disc by the Pathé company, who introduced discs which were vertically cut, vertically modulated about 1904, I think. And then Vocalion and Genet in its early days used vertically cut discs about the time of the First World War or slightly before, because they were dodging the patents of the British Gramophone Company, HMV, American Columbia, and I think that was all. American Columbia and HMV, tied in with Victor Records in America, had the patents on lateral cut recording until 1916. So a lot of companies were forced into vertical cut. Edison decided to go for it because he liked the idea of putting the grooves very closely side by side, and you can fit a lot more grooves onto a disc if the modulation is vertical. So that his discs, instead of playing 3 minutes like an average 10-inch disc, could play 5 or 6 minutes per side, allowing them all sorts of leeway where long pieces of classical music or even indeed jazz with extra improvisation was concerned. But Edison came out with his vertical cut so-called diamond discs in about 1913, produced them until 1929, and that machine that I demonstrated at the start of this live stream was one of them. I have two. One I inherited from my grandfather in not so good condition after 103 years. He bought it in 1919 in my father's family all my father's life. And now I've got it, Chippendale model, and that London model came as a very generous gift from a collector friend who was downsizing about 12 months ago. And I don't know why it's in such good condition. It looks like it's just come off the factory floor, and the thing was manufactured in 1924. You tell me, we'll both know. But yeah, vertical cut recordings, when Edison dropped out of the game in 1929, that was kind of the end of them commercially. But Western Electric, specifically for radio station usage, brought out a thing called Wide Range Hillendale in about 1933. And by 1935, 3KZ and a few other selected commercial radio stations in Melbourne were actually licensees of that wide range system, which in the mid-30s could replay off records with a special moving coil pickup cartridge up to 12 kilohertz. And that's not 12 bullshit kilohertz. I've got a couple of the records, and they are just that high in fidelity. So it was possible for vertical cut recordings to be high in fidelity. It's just that it never really caught on. When they went to stereo, the modulation was on the two walls of the groove, 45 degrees for one channel, 45 degrees for the other. Two channels in phase gives you vertical modulation. Two channels in phase gives you lateral modulation of the stylus. Two channels out of phase gives you vertical modulation of the stylus. So stereo records are actually a combination of both lateral and vertical. That's enough for one over. I'll hand it back to Dave, VK3ECG, hoping I haven't bored you to tears, Dave. VK3ECG, VK3AML.
Yeah, just with a short pause. VK3AML group, VK3ECG. Yes, no, not at all. Fascinating stuff. And the only other thing I can add to the story of grooves is the fascinating story about Arthur Lindgren. I don't know if you've come across Arthur Lindgren. Arthur Lindgren was an American physician, but he had this amazing party trick. He'd never actually been, I think, a great musician per se, but he could look at any basic classical music LP, and if the label was obscured, he could look at the pattern of the lines just with the naked eye and work out what the piece of music was. And he did this as some sort of party trick, and basically it was really about less about the notes of the music, but more the volume and the changes in dynamics in the music. So he saw the grooves and the pattern of the grooves, and could use that to work out what the piece of music was by the pattern of dynamics of the piece. it was actually quite limited. I think he could only do it from sort of Beethoven onwards or something, and it didn't really work with chamber music or those sorts of groups. It was mostly, I think, major orchestral works and operas and things like that. But he was quite remarkable. He was on TV a few times, actually once with George Schulte, absolutely fascinating to see him sort of do this. There's a film of him doing it actually with George Schulte as well, and getting them right. And I think he did it at some sort of dinner party. Everyone was fascinated by it, and then he continued to do it and became quite well known for it, which just goes to show that the pattern is visible, and you can learn something from it. But I mean, we've all known that when we played LPs and so on. We would often find a piece of the music, and you could tell where it was by just looking at the disc and the change in the sort of pattern and the sort of light and shade of the grooves. Presumably they got, I can't remember now, but I presume they got lighter as they got larger, because the increased incursion, I suppose, made the which had large, louder parts of the music would have. I did certainly like that early orchestral stuff, the Stravinsky and so on, with the Ballet Petrushka and so on. That's which is a really interesting work, and again, Stokowski was the conductor. Leopold Stokowski was quite a charismatic figure in his own right as well, and interestingly was notorious for all his arrangements. He would arrange earlier music. He arranged a lot of Bach for orchestra and things like that, and he regularly rewrote the classical works. He didn't like the ending, so he rewrote it the way he wanted it to be, and something which the purists today will be horrified at, but was quite acceptable in those days. And again, it fits with the sort of, he just created the sound he wanted. And in fact, he was very engaged with recordings and audio recordings. It was one of his big sort of interests as a conductor. He really promoted a lot of classical music in an era where it perhaps hadn't got quite the sort of attachments. But yeah, there we are. Yes, chirp programming. Yes, well, I've done a bit of chirp programming of handhelds and mobile things and so on, and it works quite well actually. But of course, with the offset issue, just got to treat each channel like a completely new memory and just program everything into that memory, which is essentially what you're doing with chirp. Whereas if you rely on the standard offsets, just say it's a repeater minus or whatever, then you're absolutely right, Peter. The changes these days make that less and less attractive, and I've sort of given that up now on the. I've only got one sort of mobile thing here, and I just basically program each channel entirely separately. It's really the only way of doing it. Anyway, back to you, Chris. VK3AML on the group, VK3ECG.
Do we have any breakers there? VK3 Alpha Mike Lima, standing by. Nope. Okay, yeah, recognising what's on a record by the look of the grooves, well, I can get as far as telling whether the music, it's either music or spoken word, because the pattern of the grooves for music tends to be continuous modulation, and spoken word, of course, is bursts, and you can pick that on the grooves. Incidentally, for those who saw the Columbia documentary, that is a Columbia disc from 1928. See if I can get it into focus. There we go. It wants to focus on the reflections it's got. And that particular disc is a duet by a team calling themselves Flotsam and Jetsam, B.C. Hilliam and Malcolm McEachran. Hilliam was a POM, Malcolm McEachran was on an Australian base, I think originally from Sydney, and they found that there was considerable amount of money to be made by not singing so much classical stuff, but by singing songs which they'd composed themselves, which were send-ups of everyday life. Izzy and Ozzy, Izzy Lizzy is one from the late 1930s, but this is one of their first discs. The businessman's love song backed with optimist and pessimist, and that's recorded actually in those studios that we saw earlier in Earlsfield in Wandsworth, south-west London, I think. Huge factory there with a studio attached. I think they also had a city studio for Columbia. I think it was called the Petit France Studio for some strange reason. George Schulte, Arthur Lindkin. I'll have to look up that name, see if there's any evidence of him on video doing that party trick. And incidentally, it was Stravinsky on that film, not Stokowski. I got it wrong myself. Fortunately, it's on the intertitle. I'll be shown up as an idiot, but then that'll make no difference to my everyday life, as everybody thinks that's already. Okay, round to Peter, VK3ACZ. I'm sorry you didn't see the night's programming, Peter. There was one item, the Edison item, I had to cut short. Didn't realise it was under copyright. It's all of 30 years old, but still that doesn't make it 50 years old, and more certainly out of copyright. And obviously there are bots that wander the net chasing. I got a immediate notification, so I terminated it, and if you terminate before they terminate you, I think it's called fair dealing, and they let it slip through. I might get a warning, I don't know. But copyright on YouTube is such a minefield. I just go ahead with what I can, and if I get a notification, I trim the YouTube clip appropriately. Can be done fairly easily. The only time I've really run into trouble was with somebody who 3.5 years after I put up a video, was actually of a hamfest, somebody at that hamfest complains about his privacy being invaded. Well, I removed the clip because it was a fairly stale old clip of an EMDRC hamfest, but I still think, in view of the fact that it had already been up for 3.5 years and probably duplicated all over the place, really it's crying over spilt milk. VK3ACZ and group, VK3AML.
VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ returning. Yes, I feel at a bit of a loss not having watched the video, but trust me, I certainly will as soon as we're finished here. And I'll just one word about that offset changing. It's peculiar to my 991 Alpha, the Yaesu, because what happens if you've got 15 repeaters programmed in, they're all 5 meg offsets, and then the next one is a 7 meg. It, for unknown, inexplicable reasons, changes all the others to 7 meg as well. I thought I must have been doing wrong, so I contacted Yaesu themselves, and they just advised me to use the split process, and that's a little bit annoying. Not impossible, but it's nice to have radio like all my handhelds. You know, they program individual channels, and you can have whatever offset you want in them. So, as I said, it's something peculiar to the 991. But anyway, Chris, I was gratified to hear you say that about the Edison versus Tesla movie, because I saw that and I was immediately left with my own feeling of discomfort. And I did a bit of digging around and research, and I couldn't sustain the idea that the movie presented so boldly and openly. But having said that, though, it shouldn't have come as a surprise to me at all. I remember Chariots of Fire, a movie that I thought was rather good back in, what would it have been, about 1980-odd. And I took that pretty much as gospel, for want of a better word, and I was surprised to find out some of the more interesting features, like Eric Little is told while he's on the boat going over to France that the heats for the 100 metres will be on a Sunday, and of course his Christian conviction won't allow him to compete on a Sunday. He knew months before that the heats for the 100 were going to be on a on a Sunday. There was no meeting with the royal family and heads of the Olympic Committee and all that to try and persuade him to run. You know, that was a foregone conclusion. And Harold Abraham's in that famous scene where the two of them ran and Harold had that big dummy spit afterwards where his girlfriend had to go and console him. They never actually raced. So there you go. A lot is done for poetic license, and I'm just disappointed as a ham and as an enthusiast of history that Edison versus Tesla movie was pretty much as you said it was. So there you go. Truth never gets in the way of a good story, does it? Anyway, I'm noticing a bit of QS Baker on everybody's signals. I know it's blowing so hard it would blow a dog off a chain tonight, but the trees must be moving around or something. I hope that it's not too noticeable on my signal. It's just in the background there. But enough for this over. Chris, back to you. VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ.
Yeah, I've noticed everybody's signal fading up and down a bit. And somebody dropping an occasional carrier, but it's not affecting intelligibility. So I think it is the wind. I've been hearing rumbles as the solar panels on my roof shake a little bit. Very low frequency rumbles. And I'm told, I think 3SKT Adam came on before the transmission tonight to say that the next few days will be pretty wild and woolly. I was planning on doing some replacing of antenna feeds tomorrow morning, so it looks like that'll be out, at least as a comfortable and safe exercise. Yeah, there are a lot of license taken by Hollywood, particularly with historical truth. These Hollywood films tend to be written by people who either have access to grind or are pushing a particular line. The Tesla thing, though, has become a bit of a cult because I honestly think that Tesla lost his mind slowly over period, and some of the ideas that he came up with, particularly after the turn of the 20th century, were so nutty. The free power, for example, collected from the atmosphere. Well, there's a voltage gradient, but there's not much power in it. And if there is power in it, it's a lightning bolt, and how you harness that burst of huge amount of current and spread it over a longer period is anybody's guess. Nobody's yet succeeded in doing that. I noted, by the way, with regard to the Tesla thing, that the acceptance of some of Tesla's nuttier ideas by people who are not technical has resulted in a few notable cases of swindles going on, and I suspect, without naming any names, that there's a swindle going on industrially in New Zealand at the moment. A company, purportedly a company, based in the North Island of New Zealand, has claimed that they're going to distribute power, like to houses, wirelessly. Now, in the live stream I did about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I said that yes, it's possible to do it, but it can only be done with 50% efficiency, or usually much less. Typically 10% efficiency is the best the military and NASA can do, and if that's the best they can do, it's the best anyone can do. So using wires actually is a little more efficient. And I suspect that this company or this person or whoever it is in New Zealand has spoken to a government agency and persuaded them that the Tesla idea is viable in the 21st century. And they've obviously persuaded somebody around a boardroom table who has zero engineering knowledge. So the Tesla thing, I think, is becoming potentially financially and technically dangerous. A lot of those ideas like free energy. How many times do you see people who are in the sort of New Age woo area coming up with the idea of standby for free energy? It's being suppressed by them, the eponymous them. them. VK3DLW, if you're still with us, VK3AML.
Yeah, still with you, Chris. VK3AML in the group, VK3DLW. Yeah, look, that's echoing exactly what I was thinking about Tesla. I think cult is the right word. I was thinking, popular crap, but woo, yeah, as that as well. But it is a cult, and I think, in a way, and it really fits in with the sort of anti-science nonsense and pseudoscience nonsense that you hear, that seems intent on vilifying, the technically valid work that Edison did. I mean, most of the arguments about, whether he just exploited other people's ideas and whether they got payment for it, but that's a whole other issue, I think. But him versus Tesla, I mean, so many of Tesla's ideas were just simply debunked. And when I read them, I thought, well, they just don't make technical sense. And the whole problem is that there is so little technical expertise at management levels now that this sort of stuff gets mileage in companies as well. I've worked in companies, and you see the management decisions that are made, and you think, these people have no technical expertise at all, and what's more, they don't want to listen. And the last job. Do it anyway, and so I was so glad to depart just at that point. But yeah, look, it is cultish, really, that sort of stuff, unfortunately. But it just fits in with everything else that goes on about 5G. And anyway, don't get me started. Now, interestingly, you mentioned New Zealand. I don't know whether you recall, but the underground cable feeding most of the power to Auckland, I think it cooked itself, or got cooked through being overloaded. And just looking at the manufacture of those cables, I'm just imagining the expertise involved in rejointing one of those cables in a reliable way. And in fact, I seem to recall that in New Zealand they found they didn't actually have the expertise in country. I think they had to import it from Australia in the end, and then had to hunt for it. But I think the centre of Auckland was without power for a matter of months, I think. It was quite a deal at the time, because I can only imagine what sort of expertise is required to joint a cable like one of those. And yeah, dangerous chemicals. Yeah, those work environments just look horrifying. I mean, I think back to some of the things I did as a kid. I used to etch aluminium panels in caustic soda. In fact, I think it was on the suggestion of magazines like Electronics Australia and Radio, TV and Hobbies to say, oh, you want your panel to look nice, white, matte finish, just dump them in caustic soda. But there was, I'm glad I survived the experience. I used to drop them in a bath of I don't know what I dropped in, probably an old baking dish or something, and used to get these aluminium panels in a nice matte shade of white, because they come up really well. But I don't know that if my kids came to me and said they were going to do that, I'd probably be pretty horrified. I can only conclude my parents had no idea what I was doing, or how potentially dangerous it might be. And yeah, you wonder about how, what the survivability rates of the folks who are engaged in that sort of activity was. I mean, I had an uncle who was a spray painter and a smoker, and he learnt to spray paint when he was in the Air Force, and brought that home and started a business. But it was at the time where, there were no safety standards that I'm aware of, and no precautions taken, no ventilation, no forced ventilation systems, nothing like that. And unfortunately, yes, he died at a quite early age of throat cancer. Now, Peter, for you're after an audio report, I think, too. It's very good quality audio. It's not quite as punchy or loud, I guess, as Dave or Chris. So if you could probably push the deviation up a little bit if you wanted to. You know, maybe make it a bit easier for someone who's trying to receive you when they're mobile. And yeah, David, just on these sessions prompt memories for me. I can remember you mentioned the guy who could recognise a piece of music by looking at a record. I experienced the one and only science practical exam that was done when I was in high school. It never got repeated. I'm never quite sure why, and I can't remember whether we actually got any results from it. But one of the tests had a piece of a record, and it had different sections of it masked off, and we were asked to identify which one had the highest frequency, which one had the highest amplitude, that sort of stuff. I think it was probably when I was in about, I'm guessing about year 11, I'd reckon. We had a highly enthusiastic physics teacher who came up, I think it was his brainchild, to have this science practical exam. That's the one that stood out. I can't remember what other things we did, but it never got repeated. It was the only one I ever experienced. And Chrissy, I remember Flotsam and Jetsam, probably because my parents told me about them. But Izzy and Ozzy, Izzy Lizzy, I think. Yeah, I can remember that. And yeah, copyright's a challenge. We've had cases where, you know, we've just had videos taken around here during, you know, a gathering with a little bit of music playing faintly in the background, and YouTube's seen fit to delete the audio from those. I guess we're probably lucky they didn't take the whole thing down. And in terms of signal strength, Chris, you're 60/9. Peter, you're strength 9. I think you're pretty much the same. I can't notice any difference. You're all noise free here, and I guess after with FM it doesn't really matter too much after that. Anyway, I shall make this a final. I really need to go to bed pretty soon, and thank you once again, Chris, for a fascinating evening. And yeah, really enjoyable, really fascinating information, as is the discussion afterwards. VK3AML, VK3DLW in the group.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. Thanks very much. Really appreciate that, and appreciate your presence. Interesting about the science prac with determining what was loudest and what pitch. Frequently I can't do it without comparison. If I have a chromatic pitch pipe, I can blow it, give the frequency, and then do a comparison. But some people have perfect pitch, musicians mostly. They can actually sing middle C within a few cycles, just from memory. I couldn't do it to save my life. Now, with regard to the wireless transmission of energy in New Zealand, I've just found the web page. It's being done by a company called EMROD, EMROD, and they are demonstrating a system, they claim, now named Skyflow, one word, SKYFLOW. It's currently being assembled in Taranaki, and it's a remote part of the North Island, near Mount Egmont, I think. And they say EMROD's wireless demonstration system has arrived in Taranaki, and the EMROD team are currently assembling it. We are looking forward to testing the world-first long-range wireless power transfer technology at the end of June. The electricity will be sent wirelessly over a distance of at least 200 metres. That's not what I'd call a very long distance, though. Maybe across a river it might be helpful, but This technology is expected to see an uptake in sustainable energy. I wonder why. I can't see the connection there. And increased access to reliable power for communities. Again, I don't understand the connection between that and wireless transmission of power. They might be achieving it somehow, but I don't see any concrete signs. This EMROD company, it says, EMROD, it's the end of an era and the beginning of an exciting new phase for EMROD. This is the moment our power beaming system and they show two dirty great big crates on low loaders. Our power beaming system leaves the indoor testing facility and heads out to the field to a warm welcome by ARA RK and Power Co. Shifting from having mostly MROD's internal team involved to wider exposure to commercial and government partners. We have a first stage rocket separation, second stage booster ignite. It sounds like buzzwords to me. I may be proved wrong, but it sounds to me like somebody's bright idea which is bound eventually to fall on its face, but I may be wrong. Who knows? MROD. MROD Wireless Energy. EMROD. Look it up. You may find some interesting stuff. So that's the latest I have on that. So it's round to Dave, VK3CG. Just looking down your list here. Somebody on the text chat. God, we've got a lot of text chat. I haven't had a chance to look through much of it. But Paul 3HN is there, Van Dan Escobar, VK Pirate, who I think is somebody about 3 miles from me, Tom George, Martin Arnold, record collector friend from way back, who apparently enjoyed the Columbia stuff greatly. FTJS is there, ZL1BQD Rowley, up in the North Island of New Zealand, chap calling himself Bullseye. Harb's Electronics Lab, I think he's in America somewhere. Must be very wee hours of the morning there. Looking down the list. Bill Rizos, also from abroad. John Young. Gosh, there are quite a few. We had 26 on the chat at one stage. It's now down to 19. And John Young says that the Queen's Platinum Jubilee is about to, well, has occurred. I think she may be the longest serving monarch ever, but then of course with modern medicine one can expect them to live a little bit longer. Yeah, hi Terry, I see your comment there. An Osmosis 1951, a very good night from VK3CJN. I think that's Clint. Stay safe in the wild weather next week, Chris and company. Okay, we will, if we can. So it's over to you, Dave again, VK3ECG and group, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML and group, VK3ECG. And good night to you, Graham, and great to have you on with us. It's been fantastic. And he was absolutely obsessed by early recordings. So he, as a conductor in Philadelphia and so on, and so it's interesting because he had to have a long sort of history of getting involved with the early recording industry as well. So interesting character, both of them really. Yes, the anything with hot sodium hydroxide is incredibly nasty, and it's interesting if you get sodium hydroxide on your hands or any of the alkalis like that. It has this immediate soapy feel. It feels like soap because it's actually dissolving away your keratin, and it's one of the better things to do when you're trying to dispose of remains. I've only had one case of that in my career, but it certainly it has occurred on the odd occasion. And there are some very famous examples of it, of course. At some stage we'll have to do a little bit about the Crippen case and the use of radio to catch a criminal on the boat, which of course was a nice example of that. Yeah, perfect pitch is interesting, isn't it? I'm never sure whether it's a blessing or a curse. I certainly don't have perfect pitch, and although it's interesting, I can hold, the note in my mind for quite some time. So in rehearsals and people going backwards and forwards and things and so on, I can often remember what the particular note sounds like and can immediately go back to that note. But 5 minutes later, I've lost it completely. And sometimes you can do it against your own vocal range. You can get a rough idea where things are, but a lot of the time it really confuses some people, because of course if they do have perfect pitch, then if an instrument is out, it sounds wrong to them. If a piano is tuned to a slightly different frequency or using a different pitch, they can get very, very confused. Or if a conductor wants to transpose the written music up a note or something like that, that really can cause them a lot of problems. Because they see the note on the page and they immediately hear what it should be in their ear, but the conductor has changed it and has transposed the music to another key, and that can cause them terrible troubles. But there we are. I wonder with the Emerald stuff. I had a quick look, and I know what you mean. I just wondered whether, without looking at, I haven't looked at any of the engineering stuff and so on, whether it's related to difficult geography, a geography where it will be difficult to run either overhead power lines or underground power lines across rock areas and mountain areas and things like that. Because if there was some line of sight and you had a series of repeater stations or something like that, if you've got an endless, boundless source of energy from renewables or something like that, even if your efficiency rate, dropped down to sort of, 5 or 10% across a long line area, if you had pretty much an unlimited source with renewables, perhaps it might actually be cost effective to do something like that rather than go to the expense of trying to run underground or overhead lines in an area where where the geography is so difficult. But perhaps Ronnie knows something about that, and as well. It just occurred to me that might be the one sort of potential way of thinking about it. But as you say, the efficiency in the ranges is very, very limited. But you need a large number of sort of repeaters, I suppose, to do that. But each one, of course, would have its own efficiency knock-on effect, I suppose. But there we are. Yeah. Yes, the signals have been fading a bit tonight. Your signal's a bit down on what I thought it would be, and whether it's my end or your end, I don't know. But I have to take the squelch back a little bit because although it seems to be fully quietening, for some reason it wasn't breaking my squelch all the time, and maybe powers down a bit, or as you say, it's a bit of wind or blowing antennas around a bit. I've got to try and get this 2-meter collinear taken down and recoaxed, because it really is. It's got a fairly grotty bit of RG57 on it and 58 on it, and it's really needs to have a bit of an upgrade of the coax to be a little bit more efficient. I think I've got quite a bit of loss the way it's organised at the moment. Anyway, I shall have to make it my final, I suppose, as well, because I've got to be the roadie for my wife's Renaissance dance concert in Warrandyte this tomorrow. So I'm doing all the hall setup and the chairs and the front desk and a whole variety of bits and pieces and things like that, and probably do a bit of filming and recording and so on and so forth as well. So I better get myself organised tomorrow morning for that. So I'll say sympathies everyone, and thank you very much, Chris, for a fantastic, interesting set of videos, and great to see Stravinsky actually conducting. And I love Petrushka. It's such a wonderful ballet, and it's got the most amazing pieces, and the rhythms. I mean, that was what Stravinsky sort of was sort of almost known for, the way he changed the way in which rhythm was used, and absolutely fabulous recordings, and hearing what a composer was getting out of an orchestra, because that's the sound they wanted. I think it has really been enlightening having those sorts of recordings of who now we consider, established classical composers, but for the first time we have those recordings, and we're not worrying about trying to do what people did with trying to see if they could get some of the old painting masters and get the audio from the canvas by seeing what marks the brush imprints left in the paint. Maybe that's another form of a slightly vague and mysterious and slightly dubious technology. 73s everyone, VK3 ECG.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. It's getting towards 12:30 anyway, so we probably should start to make tracks. And we'll hopefully catch up next week. I'll be interested to see what Steve Langley, 3SL, says about all of the recording documentaries, particularly the Columbia one from the late 20s. When I originally found that, it was uploaded as 4 separate FLV files. This is back about the year 2000. And I thought, I bet this will be either a source that will disappear, or this documentary material will disappear, or the page will disappear. So I made a point of downloading them. I'm glad that I did. Next time I saw it, some other person had watermarked over the original watermark and reduced the definition by a factor of about 4. Then it appeared under a third watermark on another web page, again with the definition degraded. So what I did was to go back to the original FLV files that I downloaded, I should say, about 18 years ago, and then put them through processing in Sony Vegas, removed the colour blotches, changed what's called the gamma of the film so that the overexposed sections wouldn't look quite so crushed out on white, and emphasised the edges as a system for effectively increase what looks like increasing the definition. It's not in reality, it just looks that way, but it can enhance the aesthetic qualities of what remains. And of course it's a very scratchy old print, but it was so comprehensively produced for a documentary of its time, a half hour's worth of a tour of a record factory in 1928. That's such a rare view that I felt obliged to spend some time on it, and that's why I've put it up there tonight and researched the commentary on it. Mind you, I've worked with early recordings as a specialty in archives over a 50-year period. And even before that, in my childhood, I was collecting 78s from the local op shops because they were cheaper than current recordings. So I sort of worked my way through into the business through, first of all, the records themselves as a child, and then collecting catalogues and discographies. And finally, in adult life, in my early 20s, late teens, I met quite a few people who had been involved with recording back to the acoustic era, which in the early 70s had only been 50 years earlier, now all dead. I'm kind of glad that I did so much mixing with older people when I was a kid, because it gives you the ability to look so far back into different techniques that are being used for the first time, gives you an ability to, I think, foresee certain techniques that, if they were of merit, might be revived at a distant time when technology catches up. I'll go into that further in another night's session. Peter, are you still with us, or shall we wind up? VK3ACZ and group VK3AML.
VK3AML in the rapidly diminishing group, VK3ACZ returning. Yeah, I might tie the ribbon with you, Chris, unless you want to go on. 732 Graham, if you're still listening, and thanks for the audio report. Yeah, I'm more worried about overdriving the thing than underflogging it. It's going to be my satellite radio too, because I picked the basic model with the two receivers. But and 7.3 to you as well, Dave. Good to have caught up again. I had a little story to tell you about. I had a tube down the throat during the week, and it's funny because the last time I had a tube down the throat, and I was hoping they didn't get it mixed up with the one that goes up from the nether regions, but the funny thing was in my 20s when I had it done, there was no proper anaesthetic. There was a bit of sedative given, but it was awfully uncomfortable having that local anaesthetic sprayed in the back of the throat to try and stop you gagging. This time the anaesthetist said, I'm just going to give you a little nap, and boy, he was right. I didn't even know I was going under. But there you go. Grateful for the new technology that certainly makes it a lot more pleasant. But a couple of things, Chris. Clint is 3CSJ. I think you said CJN. That'll be Chris in Lilydale. Nice guy too. Met him at one of Tom's get-togethers in Columbia Park. And Queen Vicky, she was, if I remember rightly, she was monarch from 1837, something like 63 years, and Elizabeth has gone way past that, but it was certainly fun to pick up that. I'm a bit of a sucker for those special event stations. I liked a bit of notoriety. I did tell you about working Victor 5-1 Mike Alpha yesterday. I heard a Uganda station on, and I know it's always a good sign when I have to look up where the call sign's from. It was something like 4x6x or was it 6x 4x? I don't know, something like that. But anyway, the pile-up was massive. I've never heard anything worse. He called, and then for the next 30 to 60 seconds there was just a cacophony of call signs, and it was the biggest pile-up mess I've ever heard. But anyway, I digress a bit. Perfect pitch, that got commented on. Chris, I just have to say again, the salvos, if you get the chance to hear the salvo band playing, jump at it, because they were fantastic. It wasn't quite my genre. It was all Phantom of the Opera and Les Miserables and all that other stuff that I don't really recognise because I'm not a concert goer of that kind. But certainly good quality musicians, and highly impressed. That's a good list of viewers you had on tonight, Chris. I don't need to give you any flowers at all. I think the popularity of your segment every Saturday night speaks for itself now, and I'm just appreciative that others think it's good as well. M-Rod, yes, sustainable. Sustainable, Chris, is the new catchword, isn't it? It's going to save the world. High. At the moment, all I seem to be able to see is that it's bumping up prices, but we won't get into that because that's as bad as politics. And 200 metres. Yeah, am I the only one who doesn't think that that's really a lot to rave about? And I wonder, is it the death ray? Will a bird flying between the transmitter and receiver, will a bird get flight and disappear into a puff of feathers? Haha. Anyway, enough of all that. Hope Prue is improving. Hope she's getting better. Please tell me in your next over how she's getting on. And now there was one other thing I wanted to mention. Oh yes, club meeting won't be Monday because we're all away on radio camp, but it'll be Monday week if you can see your way clear for that. Hope you'll be there to join the rest of the group. But anyway, make this my final and say 7-3 and good night to you and the listeners. And thanks for doing what you do. I'm about to turn it on and watch it as if it was live. Anyway, thanks again for being there, Chris. VK3AML, VK3ACZ.
Have we got any final breakers before we close? VK3 Alpha, Mike Lima. No, sounds like I've just got to tie the ribbons. And hello to Paul 3HN. Have a tremendous amount of admiration for Paul. He completely builds from the ground up AM transmitters for 80 metres with the most superb modulation based on switch mode, Class D modulators, which I find incredible. Very high efficiency modulation in AM. It's very difficult to achieve. And Alex McKenna saying it will be fascinating to hear any recollections about the Vocalion firm in Melbourne. I know a lot about Vocalion, Alex. One of their office boys was a very good friend of mine in the 70s and 80s, a chap named Ken Swadzer, who towards the end of his life was completely blind. Now, he ran, after his involvement with Vocalion, a amusement recording booth at Luna Park in Melbourne from the 40s to, I think, 1964. And another person that I contacted about Vocalion was the daughter of their general manager. This was the first company to make electrical recordings in Melbourne. There had been a pre-electric company briefly in Brighton before that, but Vocalion, I think May 1928, opened the first electrical recording studio in Melbourne. And Joan Gendel was her name, Gendle. She was a nurse, but she had kept all of her father's scrapbooks and photographs, so I went through them with black and white camera, medium format, and just copied every page. Fascinating stuff. The formulae for the waxes was there, photographs of each stage in the recording studio in 654 Burke Street, Melbourne, about 2 doors east of the Spencer Street Post Office in Burke Street at the western end of Melbourne. And their pressing plant and factory where they made the waxes and pressed the records was in Coppin Street, most of it only recently demolished in the last 5 years, I think. There's a small part of the building surviving, needless to say, resumed now for exclusive inner city living in Richmond. But Vocalion's an interesting one, and yes, I can do a doco on that. We'll have plenty of illustrations, very little film. They did shoot some very early sound-on-disc talkies in the Vocalion studio, and the film of one of them has survived, and the sound recording to another has survived, but the two don't match up, unfortunately. It's one of those things. So with that, I'll now call it quits for the evening. We have had some QRM through the night, which is a bit of a pity. It just means that I will accelerate efforts to stream from Zoom. We'll continue to transmit and take QSOs on 147.5 if we can, but there are some pretty sad people on ham radio. It's a pity, but in most cases both 3ACZ and 3DLW are so far above the interfering stations. It's only Dave, 3ECG, who's a worry. So I might make a little homemade 2-metre beam pointed at Dave so that he'll overcome that. With that, I'll wish you a very good night. See you next Saturday night at 9:30 p.m. and hopefully this current live stream won't disappear off the net as a result of the slight copyright problem we had at the start with the Edison material. Incidentally, the picture I took in the other room of one of the Edison disc phonographs made me realise, wearing a light shirt, it shows a very bad middle-aged paunch. I've got to go on a diet. So this is VK3AML saying a very good night to everybody. Thank you for being on. And hello to Martin Arnold, who I haven't seen face to face since the two of us interviewed the late Ern Pettifer, who was the leader of the band at the Palais de Danse in St Kilda in the 20s, and that was in 1973. So it's almost 50 years since I've seen Martin Arnold. He can see me via YouTube live stream, obviously, but if I saw him, I'd probably have a bit of a shock. Good night, people. Thank you so much for being with us. VK3 Alpha Mike Lima now closing on 147.475. And that's the radio off. Now, for the people on the live stream, Bullseye from northern New South Wales. Copyright on YouTube is totally unpredictable. As I think I've said many times before, I work on the adage, seek forgiveness, not permission. So you try to guess what's out of copyright. Occasionally you run foul. What can you do? Just trim the clip. Mid-North Coast. Yeah, I knew some people at... what's the name of the place where there's a jail by the sea and a rather nice restaurant next to it, north of Port Macquarie, Maxville and all that area I know quite well. Just looking through the comments there, seeing if there's anything I have to particularly comment on. And talking about work cover, yes, well, you heard Dave 3ECG, who works in forensic science and knows a lot about toxicology and industrial processes. I continually raise his eyebrows, I think. Okay, glad to that people have found the early recording documentaries of interest. It's a particular interest of mine. It's a bit out of line of ham radio for normal purposes, but I thought it was worth grouping together a number of the documentaries and running them as one hit in a week. So with that, trying to find the right button, I'll stop streaming and wish everybody a very good week. If you have any susceptibility to windstorms around Melbourne, be aware the next few days are going to be a bit wild and woolly, so tie things down. And for those who are interested in my wife's situation, steadily improving but feeling very tied down by her lack of ability to walk more than about 20 paces. She has, however, resumed driving a car, so she feels hugely enhanced in her freedom by that. So some good, some bad. Slow recovery. All the best, people, and we'll see you, I hope, and hear from some of you next week.